I'd say with Terra Nullius, it's a concept that some people still talk to as if it's present and accurate. And that's the idea that there was no one here beforehand, a land belonging to nobody. And I know that some of this in the textbooks coming out soon is reference to the fact that colonisers didn't think that there was a structure in place or systems in place with Aboriginal people that were here when they arrived. They saw it as a bit of a nomad lifestyle and didn't actually understand the cultures and the deep history and the rules and the culture embedded and the law, which I'm referring to as LORE as opposed to LAW, that was already here before them. So the concept in and of itself is false, and it's also highly offensive to disregard First Nations people that came here long before any colonisation occurred. So being mindful of that when teaching that topic and being very clear that this was a falsehood, it wasn't an accurate representation of Australia before the British arrived. In terms of the stolen generation, this is a really touchy and sensitive topic, and there will be people in that classroom that likely have been affected by the stolen generation. I think it's easy to forget how recent in history this was and how for some people still strongly believe it's ongoing in terms of dispossession and displacement of children, especially Aboriginal children. And people are still alive today that are part of the stolen generation.
It's something that has come from obviously missions. So when teachers do speak about something like this, I think it's important to realise the impacts that this has. Just being aware of all the stuff that has stemmed from stolen generation, such as the loss of languages. People, when they were on the missions, they were made to essentially talk English, to preach religion, but also stop doing any cultural practices. So I think it's important to know that these kind of things have had such a heavy impact, and then having that half-caste Act law that was then kind of put in. I think as well, if there are any Aboriginal students that are in the classroom, they may be affected and be part of the stolen generation. So I think where teachers do touch on these subjects, I think it's important to also have this, to speak to children about this, or young adults, that this is something that may be brought up, and it is such a sensitive topic. So I think something to discuss something like this is such an important subject. So I think there's a lot of misinformation around this still.
I think when it comes to recounting history in Australia, a lot of that history is directly from sources that were part of the colonising, as opposed to First Nations people that were here prior to that. And that's for a variety of reasons. That was probably to do with the fact that there was efforts made for Aboriginal people to not have a voice at the beginning and to not be able to share their version of events or stories and what that was like and what took place. So the histories have been destroyed in a lot of ways and in a lot of areas, and there's a lot of sources that have one perspective as opposed to a First Nations perspective as well.
I guess the thing as well, adding just to that, is obviously our mob weren't able to speak in our native language, a lot of that having been lost. But most of our storytelling were passed on from our children. So a lot of our stories, since they were through words and not written, they were lost. So that part of our, or what happened to us, haven't been included, or I suppose taken into consideration.
And I think that also goes to the stolen generation in terms of where there's families that are being removed and taken away from their family. How are they going to have their history passed down to them to be able to tell the truth of what happened? There was a lot of active efforts from the beginning of colonisation to make sure that couldn't happen. So being aware of that as a teacher, that there are deficits in teaching this history, and that unfortunately it's going to be a lot harder to get First Nations perspectives.